Hello, and welcome to Snow Day number 4 Productions. I'm Dr. Sarah Parks, and with me today, helping me teach about Chapter 3 of A Beginner's Guide to the Study of Religion by Bradley Herling, is Dennis. Chapter 3, Classic Theories 1, has the following 5 sections. Today we'll be just going over the ones highlighted in yellow, the intro, talking about the modern phenomenon of the study of religion, and talking about the conclusion and asking you to put on your skeptical glasses to do that. Also today is some review of previous parts of the textbook, and whenever you see things in this kind of light blue color with this picture of a cat that is, I think, drinking some coffee and studying at a laptop, it means that these are excellent review sections. So the introduction of Chapter 3, page 57, has the following quote. In the opening chapters of this book, we took methodological steps to solidify a position from which to analyze and interpret religious subject matter. So thinking of what he might mean about that from earlier parts of the textbook, I'm thinking of those 4 terms we learned: self-consciousness, comparison, defamiliarization, and empathy. What were those? Those were 4 things a person had to do in order to study religion from an academic perspective, or just to be interested in religion from a thoughtful perspective. So self-consciousness means actually being aware of yourself and your own attitudes, kind of preconceived ideas, biases, situatedness, upbringing, background, positionality. So self-consciousness, being able to describe yourself from a bit of an outsider's perspective and be like, that person will tend to be more comfortable with that and less comfortable with that, or that person will tend to know a lot about that type of Christianity, but they won't have experienced much, say, Orthodox Christianity if they're from Nova Scotia. So self-consciousness is really important methodologically to have a good position from which to study religion. Number 2, comparison. Some of the theorists we've looked at so far were really into comparison, such as Max Muller, who said, if you only have one, you have none. In other words, if you only look at one thing and have nothing to compare it to, it's really not analysis at all. So self-consciousness, comparison, lots of things to look at together that are religious or a religion or have something to do with religion in order to kind of see, like, what do they have in common, or are they all just completely different? Are they related? Number 3, defamiliarization, or making religion weird again, or taking what is familiar to you and pretending you're an alien that just landed on planet Earth and you're looking at the thing from that alien's perspective instead of your perspective, where you're really, really used to something so much that you maybe don't even see it. For example, if someone bumps into you in Canada, especially the Maritimes, you might say, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry. If they bump into you, in some other countries, they would be like, that's ridiculous. Why are you apologizing? I crashed into you. You're weird. Like, you're so, like, are you a doormat? What's wrong with you? That's bizarre. Whereas for Canadians, because it's part of our culture, to quickly say sorry, like, oh, sorry, for anything, that's so familiar to us that we might not even know why someone might find it weird or unique or special. So defamiliarization is taking things that you don't even notice because they're so familiar and trying to look at them from an outsider perspective or objectively. The 4th methodological step that your textbook suggested was needed to make a good stance from which to study religion was empathy. In other words, the type of imagination that lets you imagine what someone else or a different culture might think, or how someone might feel in a given situation, what it might be like to be someone who's not you, even if you're very different. Empathy is kind of a skilled type of creative imagination. So that's one thing that are helpful tools that we learned about earlier in the textbook for the study of religion. Another thing we learned about earlier in the textbook that's a methodological step would be understanding the 4 orders of meaning: the immediate order, the reflective order, the academic order, and the synthetic order. The first order, or the immediate, is insider, or emic, and it's exactly what a person who's religious, like a practitioner of religion, says they are doing in the middle of a ritual, or what they say, like, oh, I'm being forgiven of my sins right now. And then the reflective is still insider. The second order of meaning, the reflective order, is still insider, but it's that insider person stepping back and being like, well, what does my faith community say, like in scriptures, that I'm doing when I say confess my sins? Or what does my priest, or what do like the official leaders in the religion say? What does my community say? You're still being inside the religion, but you're going at it from a more thoughtful perspective, examining tradition and the collective. The third order of meaning, or the academic order, is what we do in class, and it is trying to step outside of an emic perspective and become etic, or outsider, or objective, trying to understand what that person is doing when they're confessing their sins from the perspective of a sociologist, an anthropologist, a scientist, or just a reporter or observer who's trying to describe accurately. And then some of our theorists think that it's impossible to be objective, and so they seek the 4th order of meaning when studying religion, the synthetic order, a synthesis, synthesizing all of the other orders, both insider perspectives and academic perspectives, putting those all together and making what Clifford Geertz might call a thick description of something religious, such as confessing sins. Another introductory quote in chapter 3 is, "We also contended with some fundamental and controversial issues that face the student in the field." And I was trying to think, what were some of those issues in chapters 1 and 2 of the textbook, and I came up with emic versus etic, or insider versus outsider. We've already seen a few theorists who take different views on which is the best way, or whether etic is even possible, which is the best way to study religion. And so we've seen that this is a hot spot of debate and frustration and a little bit of struggle. Do you discount insider perspectives because they're going to be so biased and they're going to be so firmly ensconced within just one worldview that is not an academic view of the subject? Or conversely, do you say nobody can understand a religion except those who are inside of it? Or somewhere in between, like Clifford Geertz saying, well, you need to compare the symbolism of many different kinds of religions, and you need to like look for similarities across both what the insiders say and the academics say. So emic versus etic, and we watch a great video by Ryan James who is going to come to our class and give us a guest lecture later in the term explaining emic and etic. So that was one controversial issue, and I thought of another one as part of our review: the topic of theology versus religious studies and cryptotheology. both of those are completely related to the insider-outsider problem. And we saw in some other short videos we watched that people often confuse religious studies with theology, and they're quite different, because theology is the study of God and beliefs about God, and it often assumes the existence of God, or assumes the existence of God and like an insider view of one religion. You can have Christian theology, Catholic theology, Muslim theology, Jewish theology, or just kind of like philosophical theology, theist theology. But religious studies is really the study of people. It doesn't make any claims about the existence of God or the non-existence of God. It doesn't make any claims about ultimate, like what is good or what is true. It just makes claims about human beings and how they have been religious through time in the past up until now, and their sociological kind of ways they organize themselves, and anthropological, and what their religious practices, beliefs, rituals, ceremonies mean to them. What function do they play in society? So they're really quite different, and conflating the two is kind of inaccurate. But confusing that matter is another key term we learned, cryptotheology, which is when something kind of presents itself as being academic from a religious studies perspective, objective, but it either on purpose or actually unbeknownst to the researcher is a theological perspective. Such as at the beginning of religious studies, when it was becoming a discipline, when people were defining religion and they happened to be all Christian background, and so they decided whether or not something was a religion, all different beliefs and practices all around the world, based on how much it looked like their definition of religion, which is like, oh, it has something like a Bible, it has creeds and dogmas, it has like religious leaders, it has afterlife. So even if they were kind of secular and not necessarily representing the church anymore, the theology of their particular Christian background colored their scholarship, even if they didn't mean for it to. So there's that issue that's controversial. And the biggest controversial issue that our guest lecturers have all spoken about, your whole first chapter was about, and a lot of the main theorists like Wittgenstein and Durkheim have talked about, is, and Jonathan Z. Smith, is the impossibility of defining religion, because it's kind of a new thing. It's kind of a scholarly construct, because for most of human history, what we think of as religion didn't have a name and was just seen as society. And so we cannot come up with a definition of religion that people agree on, because it isn't actually one thing. It's a whole cluster of social groupings and ceremonies and like state ordained kind of rituals, celebrations, holidays, and all of these things mixed together, spirituality, experience, life cycles, anxiety, psychology. It's way too many things to define. And so that was another controversial issue we've seen so far. Speaking of people we could review right now, Ludwig Wittgenstein from the late 1800s, early 1900s, was one of the main people who argued, look, we can't define religion. It's too many disparate things to be contained satisfactorily in any single definition. The closest we could possibly come to defining religion is like listing a cluster of sort of family resemblances that different religions might have to each other. Different phenomena, that things as different as Buddhism, Scientology, Roman Catholicism, Hinduism, indigenous spirituality, things as different as that, if there are little things that they have in common, Those are like family resemblances, much in the same way the term game can describe things as different as tic-tac-toe and, you know, Olympic luge and football. Those things look really different, and yet they're all some kind of game. So, Wittgenstein, religion is undefinable. Another person who talked a lot about the definition of religion and wrote many textbooks about it is Jonathan Z. Smith, the Gandalf of religious studies, one of the founders of modern secular religious studies, and he was the one that came up with the notion that religion is non-native. In other words, people who are inside what we know of as religion don't really talk about religions. It's more of a scholar's construct, something that scholars need when they want to pin down and analyze and describe these human groups. So it's a useful category created by and for scholars in order to be able to talk about all kinds of things: history, culture, politics, the state, psychology, expression, experiential ways of being on this earth. So that's Jonathan Z. Smith. Religion is non-native, it's a scholarly construct, and it is useful. And that means that you get to study whatever aspect of religion you want and just define it however you want to define it. Chapter 3 then goes on to talk about religion as a modern phenomenon. Quote, for long stretches of human history, it was difficult to find a place to stand outside of what we now call religion. Thinking back, the term that's here in blue is from earlier on, a great review term, religio. Religio is the Latin word from which we get our word religion, but it didn't mean what we mean by it now. It just meant those rituals, ceremonies, and actions that were sanctioned by the state for the good of the state. Such as, for example, in like first century Rome, you would have a little niche in your home, and usually the matron, or like the female head of a household, would each morning and evening go to the hearth in the home or the little niche that was beside it and do certain rituals and say certain things and make certain offerings for or to the emperor at the time. Is that religion? Well, to them, it was just being a good citizen, because the idea was that if people weren't doing this, then the gods would not take care of your city, and they would let things happen such as floods, fires, plagues, invaders, barbarians, etc. So religio, I mean, that's not how we look at it today. It's really not tied up with like the well-being of a state. It's much more personal, and there are many more groups inside a single state. So there'd be no such thing as the academic study of religion without kind of the separation from that more ancient way of looking at it, religio, like state-sanctioned rituals and ceremonies. We couldn't study religion academically if we hadn't had the rise of what's called the secular. So this chapter really goes into what is secular or non-religious. And it lists a number of factors that went into what made the study of religion possible from a secular or like non-church following standpoint. And I've listed 4 here from chapter 3. 1, the emergence of a divide between the secular and the religious. So at some point in history, maybe, let's say the 1500s, with people like René Descartes, the Enlightenment caused this notion that people should be able to study for the sake of studying and not study for this or that church or authority. And that caused this idea of 2 separate realms: the religious, which was becoming more personal and private and individual, and the secular, which was seen as more objective, and scientific, I guess, with the rise of an interest in science. Secondly, a new emphasis on reason and thinking for oneself, which brought about more focus on the individual. In fact, the rise of individualism over collectivity, which was more the way people saw themselves in the past. We see in more ancient languages the word people being singular, like a people or the people. It meant, you know, something like all Romans or all Jews. They kind of saw themselves and talked about themselves as one thing, like an ant hill. Ants are kind of a, the Borg, like they're one organism. An ant colony is one organism, and that is kind of how human beings referred to themselves or seemed to have thought of themselves more before the Enlightenment. After the Enlightenment, people seemed to separate out and trust their own reason and trust that they had within them the ability to reason apart from tradition and what they're told and culture, etc. Thirdly, your textbook, chapter 3, mentions the development of new academic disciplines. All of these things are tied together. The idea that reason was going to get you everywhere you needed to go. You did not need to listen to what you were told. You did not need to follow this or that institution. You did not need to be in good standing within any church or do studies that only pleased the church or come to findings when you do your research that only ones that the church would be happy with, such as, that the earth is in the center of the universe or what have you. The earth is only 6,000 years old. You could do whatever kind of scientific or rational inquiries you wanted, honestly, even if the findings were wildly different from what you might be told by your religion. So biblical studies as a religious studies topic that was outside of like Bible study arose. And then fourthly, renewed encounters between the West and others. So there were always encounters across different cultures. There were deep in antiquity, like trades of spices and ocean travel and whatnot. Of course, there was always travel, but at some point in the rise of like individualism and secularism and post-enlightenment science and all of this age of reason, at some point there came like a flood of new information, documents, artifacts, probably because of colonization, but like a lot more literature. And if you look in your textbook, there will be a whole bunch of examples of finds, archaeology, documents and stuff that really brought to the fore of Western society the many interesting things that were happening around the world. And there was like an exoticism or like a fetish or like a trend of being very interested in others. And so that also led to like, oh wow, human beings are really diverse. There's all kinds of different experiences, and it kind of allowed for pluralism rather than one kind of monoculture. It allowed for comparative study of religion, for example, and things like that. So all of these things were swirling together. One of the theorists this chapter brings up for the first time is René Descartes, from the end of the 1500s into the early 1600s. And so he was a philosopher, a French philosopher, but also we could kind of think of him as an early scientist. And he's in your textbook as an example, very early one, of this rise of the secular. And you've all heard his most famous quote, which is cogito ergo sum in Latin. I am thinking, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am. So sometimes called the founder of modern philosophy, people have this "I think, therefore I am" as like a trivia thing they know about Rene Descartes. But what do you think it means? "I'm thinking, therefore I exist" is the end. It's like the culmination of a long process for Descartes, and it's that long process that is so profound. In one of his most famous books, he talked about how he did an experiment of deconstruction, an experiment of unknowing, uh, an experiment of trying not to believe anything, even his own eyes, unless he could confirm them based on his own sensory observation and on logic and reason. In other words, anything he was told by society or the church, such as, children obey your parents, children should obey their parents, or, murder is wrong, or, the moon revolves, orbits the earth. Anything he was told, he tried to erase from his beliefs and only build back beliefs that he could feel matched what he observed and what was reasonable. So the funny thing is, he built a lot of the things back up that he had already thought before, like children should obey their parents and murder is wrong, and the moon does orbit the earth. And he even built all the way back up to there's probably a divine being. But when at the bottom of that process, before he constructed things all the way back up, when he had erased everything, the last thing he kept that wasn't erased from his beliefs was, well, I do exist. The only thing I can know for sure when he was at the bottom of skepticism, like the absolute most skeptical, the only thing I can know for sure is that I exist because I'm thinking right now. And then from there, he built it back up. It's so wild to think of somebody doing this. It seems very extreme and somewhat impossible, but it epitomizes this rise of the secular, where someone would be like, I don't want to trust anything that comes from tradition. I don't want to do what I'm told. I don't want to believe what I hear. I need to find out for myself. Is it valuable and worth keeping, or do I disagree with it? So literally nothing was sacred for him. Everything needed to be questioned, and then he built it back up from scratch. So that's sort of the epitome of this, the rise of the individual, the rise of individualism. Page 58 of your textbook, the status of the individual in relation to the social is a fundamental issue in studying religion. Remember that your theorists have different takes on whether they want to study religion as like a sociological and kind of collective phenomenon. And one of the main ones we've looked at who thought that was Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, who said religion is essentially a social phenomenon. In other words, not particularly a theological one. Not something that's like true in terms of like there's a God and the God has told people these things, but more like people are creatures, animals. People are social beings. They form into societies, and those societies have anxieties and needs. And religion meets the needs and addresses the anxieties. Religion is a tool to meet society's needs and address society's concerns. He defined religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things and the single moral community that adheres to them. So right in his definition is very much a social group and social needs. Like religions will say, God told us to feed the hungry. And Durkheim would say that's because human beings often have those on the margins or natural disasters that cause people to starve to death. And so religions developed a mechanism to tell people that it's a moral compulsion that you must feed hungry people, and that helps the social problem. It fixes the social problem because churches and gurdwaras and mosques are feeding people in their communities, synagogues, etc. The new theorists that you'll meet in this chapter all can be placed along an axis that's, on the one hand, completely individual. What they care about is the way they define religion is that it's something that happens inside one person, all the way over to the other axis, which is probably like somebody like Durkheim, who says religion is completely social. So this spectrum from individual to social. And if you could just think on your own for a second about examples of religious scenarios, where would you put them along the spectrum that goes from individual to social? Where would you put something like a wedding? How would you argue it falls on this spectrum? Or how would different theorists argue it falls on this spectrum? If you were on the very social end of things like Durkheim, you might say, a wedding is a way for the group to keep tabs on offspring and keep records of offspring so that they don't end up having incest, which can lead to like different kinds of illnesses or weaknesses. It's a way for the group to mark visibly when a person becomes taken rather than eligible or single. So it's a way to mark takenness so that there's like not willy-nilly like completely wild sexuality in the group, so that it's like, okay, there's a bit of a shame involved if someone tries to like break up that pair bond. So that's like defining a wedding as a very, very social thing. But you could go all the way over to an individual thing. From an emic perspective, someone might say about their wedding, oh, it was a beautiful, sacred way for me to declare before God and before all of my like family that I'm so in love with this person and I really want to officially commit to them forever. That could be a very individual way to define a wedding. And you could go down the list and think of many religious things like prayer. Is praying individual or social? Actually, it depends. If a priest is speaking a prayer in Latin at the head of a church filled with 200 people, and they're all kind of listening and like thinking the prayer along with him, that's very social. But then again, if a person is alone and they're frightened and they're like asking for help from a deity, that's very individual. Or maybe it's both. Like in that giant cathedral where a priest is speaking a prayer and everyone is listening, what's happening inside some of the people? Are some of them having a very religious experience that no one else knows about because their eyes are closed and they're being quiet, but maybe they may be experiencing emotions like extreme joy or well, who knows? So it's complicated. So this chapter delves into, is religion individual or social, and which theorists would define it one way or the other way? And the attendance password for today was going to be Peter Berger. And so, you know what? If you're listening, I'm not going to tell this to anyone, but if you email me, sparks@stfx.ca, just 2 words, Peter Berger, that is how I will give you an attendance point for today's snow day. I just thought about it. Sneaky. So Peter Berger, attendance password, email it to me for an attendance point. Peter Berger, 1900s up to just 2017, passed away a few years ago, a sociologist and a theologian, a Lutheran theologian. He said, and think about individual versus social here, human beings come into the world incomplete, not guided by only instincts like animals. So we need society to provide our structure. Society is an area of meaning carved out of vast meaninglessness, a small clearing of lucidity in a formless jungle. He wrote that in his probably most famous book, 1967, The Sacred Canopy. So for Peter Berger, you want to study religion, you are studying communities. Religion is completely social for him. And he also talks about collective knowledge. So societies, including religions, come up with a collective knowledge that helps them build meaning from chaos. Now, if you were to put on your etic glasses and try to be an objective observer and analyze Peter Berger, who said that human beings come into the world incomplete, not guided by only instincts like animals, we could pull that apart and we could say he's got some assumptions going on there. What I see there is a hierarchy. He's putting human beings above animals, only instincts. He's actually saying we're not animals in a way. Is he assuming we don't have instincts? Is he assuming we don't have kind of evolutionary impulses or biological, hormonal, instinctual drives? It seems like he thinks that, oh, animals can just survive with instincts. They don't need anybody. They don't need each other. But we do. We don't have instincts. We need society. We need structure. Without it, it's chaos, vast meaninglessness. So, I mean, he has kind of a dim view of nature, doesn't he? He has kind of a dim view of animals. He maybe doesn't spend that much time looking into animals because many of them are totally social and many of them kind of raise their offspring over a long period of years, stay in a large family group. I mean, not to go into detail, this is not a like animal biology class, but some animals like elephants even have what might look like mourning rituals where they like grieve a death and do things to mark the death. I don't know. So it's funny when you try to be an outside observer and look at some of our theorists and try to unpick like how did they get to that? What is left unsaid here? So yeah, he obviously sees society as some kind of protection from a chaotic jungle. But yes, if I gave you on a test, this is not in your midterm, a spectrum that said individual on one side and social on the other side, and I said put some of your theorists on it, you would definitely want to put Peter Berger on the social side. So yeah. The conclusion of chapter 3, we skipped a whole bunch of stuff in the middle, which we're going to do next time. The conclusion of chapter 3 is about just that. Welcome to the jungle. Like, is it really a jungle if we don't have religions, kind of communities with collective knowledge telling us what to do? Is your textbook taking an academic perspective in this conclusion? I hope you read it and put on your like suspicious glasses and just ask yourself, is your textbook taking an insider perspective, an outsider perspective? Is there any crypto theology going on in this conclusion of this chapter? Is it going a little bit emic here when it's kind of pretending to be etic? I don't know. You decide. That's up to you. What kinds of things from today might be on tests? Not your midterm, but future tests. The secular. What is secular? What is the rise of the secular? How did this separation happen? That's all in your reading, and we'll have another class with that. An outside the box class will also be about secularism. Secondly, Rene Descartes. He's an important theorist, one of the first sort of scientific thinkers. The 4 factors in the rise of religious studies as a discipline. Peter Berger, thinking about studying religion as a spectrum that can fall anywhere from individual to social, and how different thinkers would define religion and how you would define religion, and how it can be tricky because some things inside religion can be both very individual and very social at the same time. So we'll think more about that next time. And individualism, the rise of the individual, and therefore the idea that there was a time when people did not necessarily see themselves as solo entities, but more saw themselves like an ant colony or the Borg or a people, an ethnos, a nation type thing. Yeah. So next, keep rolling with chapter 3. Lots of study materials on Moodle there for the midterm, which is Thursday, thanks to snow day number 3. And thanks for staying with me. Don't forget to get that attendance point by emailing me, Peter Berger.